there's a lot of people who are in this situation where they have something happen, they go to doctors, the doctors are like, hey, we ran all the scans, we don't know what's going on. As a patient, there's an absurdity to facing that and just being like, trying to just deal with it. And I think often people in those situations end up kind of dealing with it sort of in the way that is presented in this movie. Hello and welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast from myself, Thomas Flight, and my fellow video essayist, Tom Vanderlinden, from the channel Like Stories of Old, where we seek to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the killing of a sacred deer from the director Yorgos Lanthimos. Before we get into the episode, I want to quickly mention that this is a Nebula original podcast, so if you want to support the podcast, get access to episodes a week early without any ads, and also get access to our monthly bonus episode, you can do that by signing up at nebula.tv/cinema of meaning. You can also check out the link in the show notes for more information about that. For now, let's get into the episode. So this is a movie that I've seen, I think this was my third time watching it. So I've seen it a couple times. My wife and I are both big fans of Yorgos Lanthimos. I don't know what that says about us, but we are. I've seen all his movie. Well, not all of them. I've seen a couple of them several times. This one in particular sticks in my head for some reason. I also really like The Lobster, but those two both I think are my favorites. But this is a weird one. I don't really know why I like this. I kind of only think I half know what it's about, if it's even possible to know what it's about. It's really dark. Every time I watch it, I forget how just messed up it is. Like I forget how it ends every time, and then it gets to that ending, and I'm just like, oh my goodness.
It's pretty straightforward on the surface. It's like
yes, yeah.
It's
It's about a surgeon that is played by Colin Farrell. His name's Stephen, and his family. So his wife is also a doctor, played by Nicole Kidman, Anna, and then they have two kids, Bob and Kim. And basically, kind of as it starts, we learn a little bit about their life, but we find out that the doctor, Stephen, has this relationship with this young man. They kind of meet up at a diner. They hang out together. It's a little weird and awkward. We're not sure exactly what the nature of this relationship is. But as things unfold, essentially, Stephen kind of invites Martin, this young man, into his life a little bit more. And we slowly learn that he is kind of looking after Martin because Martin's father died in a surgery, was a patient of Stephen's and died having heart surgery. So that's kind of why he's sort of acting as this surrogate father figure. And eventually, this is like an hour into the movie as it slowly sets us up, but this isn't really spoilers. This is mostly just the core of what's happening. Eventually, Bob starts falling sick and ill, and then Kim does, and we realize, or I guess Martin comes out and says it eventually, that this is sort of like some kind of curse or revenge that Martin is enacting on the family. We have no idea how or what the mechanics are of this, but Martin's like, all three of your family members are going to get sick. They're going to eventually die. And this is for revenge for my father's death, which we find out was maybe because Stephen was drinking. So there was negligence involved there. And that's why he died in surgery. And so Martin is trying to get his revenge. And the only way that that Stephen can save his family is by choosing to kill one of them. So because he let Martin's father die, he now has to choose to kill one of his own family members to save the others. And that's what's going on in this movie. And then that all just plays out in a very deadpan, straightforward way. So that's kind of what's going on. We're going to get into it, maybe like how we feel about it, what we think it means.
Yeah.
But you watched it for the second time?
Yeah. I just watched it this morning. I saw it when it came out. I also saw The Lobster, and I think The Favorite was also his.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, I like him. I don't have a particularly strong connection to his work, but his movies are always very interesting and very, interesting in a strange way, in the sense that you never quite know what you're gonna get in terms of mood and atmosphere and the themes that are being discussed. But yeah, he is developing a very specific voice that kind of borders on the absurd at times. Dark comedy or like black humor. I don't remember much of The Lobster except for Colin Farrell kicking that little kid in the shin, which I thought was just the funniest thing.
Yeah.
And the same with, as you said, with Sacred Deer. Like, I remember some beats of it, but I didn't remember the exact, like the whole sequence of events. And so I kind of felt like I was watching it again for the first time. Though I do think I connected more with it this time. The first time I was kind of like, it's kind of weird. Not sure I get it. But it does feel like a kind of movie where you really have to embrace and relish the strangeness of it all.
Yeah.
And that's usually easier when you've already seen it once, so you kind of know where the plot is going and you don't have to like direct any mental energy towards keeping track of that, and you can just enjoy the whole weird vibes that are being presented, which I do think serve some interesting deeper themes. Some are more obvious than others. Some I've already seen a lot of people talk about, others maybe less so. Also lots of interesting symbolism going on, like some interesting motifs that kind of come back throughout the story, which I think are very revealing as to the more deeper layers of this story. I think the most notable thing I realized as I was watching it this time is that I watched the M. Night Shyamalan movie Knock at the Cabin not too long ago, which was sort of the same in the sense that both of these movies present in the most basic foundation a trolley problem. Like, you have to choose between two evils, or I guess the situation is you have these two evils, one is lesser, one is greater, and you have to commit the lesser one in order to prevent the greater one.
Right.
And so in Knock at the Cabin, there's this family. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't.
Okay. I won't spoil it, but the premise of that movie is that you have this family, these two men with their child who are in this cabin, and they are visited by these intruders who then proclaim to them that the world is going to end unless they kill one of their family members. So they also have to sacrifice one of their loved ones in order to save, in this case, humanity in its entirety. And it's kind of similar to what's going on here, where the very basic premise is that Stephen has to kill one of his family members in order to save all of them, or at least the other two. He has three choices: his son, his daughter, or his wife. And if he doesn't do anything, all three will die. If he kills one, the other two will live. And But whereas I brought up Knock at the Cabin, I think sometime behind the scenes to as a potential movie for discussion, but I ultimately ended up not being in favor of it because it felt like that movie doesn't really have anything going on besides its trolley problem, and it kind of
Sure.
I think the issue that I had with Knock at the Cabin is that it presents the trolley problem and then tries to add weight to the choices. It tries to make some sort of moral judgment on what is fundamentally a kind of ridiculous premise. The whole trolley problem, I think, is kind of silly. It's not really an issue that really teaches us or informs us that much about justice. And and so when I saw Sacred Deer, like the one thing that I really liked is that's like my criticism of Knock at the Cabin is pretty much, let me put it like this, like Sacred Deer pretty much does right what I think Knock at the Cabin did wrong, but because I think what The Killing of a Sacred Deer ultimately does is it really exposes the whole absurdity and the sort of nothingness at the heart of this problem. Like we think there's a sort of, the trolley problem creates this illusion of some kind of deep, meaningful decision that's to be made, whereas in reality it's kind of a non-problem, and we'll get into more deeply why I think that is, but I think the Sacred Deer is really an effective deconstruction of the trolley problem in its essence, and thereby informs us a lot also about the meaning of justice, the role of reason and rationality within it, the role of emotional connection, and sort of just the limits of our decision making, or like reasonable decision making, which come into play here. So that's on this rewatch what I probably enjoyed the most about this movie, just from a more thematic point of view, that I think it presents this effective deconstruction of a at first glance deep philosophical problem, but one that's really more superficial than it seems, and just kind of functions in that way as a mirror to the limits of our own perception and our own judgment and our own capacity to conceive of and bring about justice.
Yeah. It's at its core, I think there's a lot there about, I think everything you're saying is true about how it's deconstructing that. But then when you deconstruct that, what you're left with is kind of this horror of, like, the horror that's in this movie is a horror of powerlessness and a horror of absurdity, or kind of the tragedy of the situation. And I have a lot of thoughts about that and how it relates to the whole theme of the movie. So I think there's a lot to get into here. Before we get into maybe specifically what this movie is commenting about, you mentioned Yorgos Lanthimos' kind of voice and the presentation. I think one of the first things you notice watching something like this is just the dialogue, the way the performances, the way the dialogue is written, and then the way the performances are acted give everything such a incredibly like stilted. It almost feels like Chat GPT generated conversations.
You know what it made me think of? The movie The Room.
Yes. Right, yes.
Except where he did it with total sincerity. It feels like Lanthimos is more aware or more deliberate in how he's presenting this kind of awkwardness.
Yeah. And I just wanted to comment on that and see, like, I think even beyond maybe the commentary he's making here about, sort of this moral conundrum or revenge or the medical system or whatever, there's just like a perception of reality and sort of social norms that he has in the way he conveys that I think is a big part of why I like it to begin with, where I just feel like watching this, or especially also The Lobster is very much in this vein too. it's just like he captures this feeling that I have sometimes when I'm looking at the world, where it just feels like none of this really makes any sense, and it feels like everybody's operating by some kind of script that I don't really fully understand, and we're just all kind of going through these weird motions, and there's rules about this world that don't really make any sense. They seem kind of weird and absurd, but we all just follow them because that's the way it is. He very much captures that with the tone in the presentation, and so I don't know. I don't think everybody feels that way. I think there's like an outsider quality. There's something that these movies capture that to me feels very at home if you've ever felt like out of place in certain social dynamics or social situations. And I just appreciate that on a base level, I think, is like the character's attempt to kind of like they're finding their way in this world, but they're not really that emotionally invested in it because there's kind of an inherent absurdity to it. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it does, and I think it even plays into the central conflict in this movie, where basically what's being suggested by Martin is that Stephen killed his father, or at least let him die due to negligence, and so he's basically arguing, you took one member of my family, now I have to take one of yours, or you have to take one of yours. Yeah. So that's his perception of justice is also this kind of balancing act, or sort of almost like a transaction where you take one of mine, I take one of yours. He even demonstrates this at one point where he's being captured by Stephen, and then he bites him in the arm, and then he bites himself in the arm really hard, and then he literally shouts like, "Do you understand? You know, it's a metaphor."
It's a metaphor. Yeah.
And that's kind of also how all the characters interact with each other. It's very dry and very much like, "Can I see your armpit hair?" "Sure." And
right. Yeah.
It's very strange, but it's very like, "I have a request." Okay, request granted or denied, and there's no real emotions, it seems, at play. Characters here don't really talk about feelings. There's no moment where you really get a sense of their deeper emotions. I guess, as I was saying that, I was thinking there's one scene where Stephen does break down at the choice he's about to face, but they don't have like an emotional interaction still with.
They never talk about how they feel.
Yeah.
Right.
Even when they're kind of later in the movie, when they realize, okay, we're gonna have to make a choice, the conversation is not so much like, oh, how could they do this to us? Or it's still very, I guess the Nicole Kidman, Anna, she does question like, why do my kids have to suffer because of all this?
Right.
But then later she's like, if we kill one of the kids, we can always make another one.
Yeah.
So it just becomes this weird. It's basically this whole emotionally detached world that we're being presented with.
Yeah.
And that the characters also exemplify.
So I think this creates a natural segue into some of the things I want to talk about, which is, I think some of what you're describing is serving in this movie, or what it's kind of trying to talk about. Because a central aspect of this film to me is the hospital, is the medical environment, is the way the children, what's happening to the kids, they run all these tests, they have like the best doctors looking at them, and they're coming up with nothing. And there's sort of like a poetic absurdity here, where it's just like, if you were going to concoct like the most horrific curse for two well-off doctors, it's like, give their children a mysterious illness that has no cause, and they just have to they can't understand it, and they just have to, watch them die, essentially. But I think this to me is like a central part of, I think, what the movie's getting at, which is kind of the horror of dealing with a medical system sometimes, or illness that you can't understand, or just being in the situation as a patient of like, something happened to me. There's a lot of people who are in this situation where they have something happen, they go to doctors, the doctors are like, hey, we ran all the scans, we don't know what's going on, maybe it's psychosomatic, you're just going to have to deal with it. And as a patient, there's an absurdity to facing that and just being like, there's these weird rules that I don't understand. I'm going and talking to these people and they can't help me. And so I'm just left with the reality of, making the most of this situation and trying to just deal with it. And I think often people in those situations end up kind of dealing with it sort of in the way that is presented in this movie, where it's like, if you're dealing with an illness and you're dying and there's nothing that you can do about it, a lot of times people will break down, people will be emotional, it's sad, it's tragic, it's terrible, but often people also just keep going on with their life as if nothing is wrong, as if like, it's just like there's this element of just accepting it and trying to move on and trying to live in some kind of normalcy. A lot of times, not everybody, but I've seen that to some extent and experienced that to some extent, and I think this movie does a really good job of capturing that aspect of like kind of the horror, the tragic horror and absurdity of inexplicable illness and being powerless to really do anything about it, and then just what do you do with the emotions that you have about that kind of situation.
Yeah, I think you can even extend that further into the more general concept of inexplicable tragedy, or even just ultimate, like more on a more cosmic level, the seeming absurdity and randomness and unpredictability of the universe that just inflicts whatever for whatever reason, and we're just kind of trying to have some sense of stability and in this case also justice within that, even though at the end of the day it's all kind of fuzzy and there's no real solid ground. And that's I think that's what this movie really dives into deeply, I think, or at least there's a lot of this that's sort of lingering beneath the surface there. That sensation that there's nothing really, like on the most fundamental level, there's nothing really that you can understand, and there's nothing really that you can do with any sort of reasonable conviction. And that because that's, when Martin presents his trolley problem, or essentially his trolley problem, to Stephen, there's this little point thereafter where Stephen tries to get a sense of which of his children is the best, so he goes to his school teacher to like try and get some hint of which one of my children is fundamentally better in some way or another. And I think that whole exploration and everything that comes after, and the thing that we talked about with Anna saying like, oh, we can have another kid and we can just replace the one that you then sacrifice, or it just kind of emphasizes the whole pointlessness or the futility of this whole, or of trying to fit this sort of concept of justice in any terms that are reasonable. You cannot really, because I think that's the whole point at the end of the day, is that there was no choice to be made by Stephen. Like whatever person he was gonna pick, it wouldn't have meant anything more than if he had chosen another one. And that's kind of where you really, I think, bump into that wall okay, we have this, or once we're confronted with this situation like this, not literally like this, but where we have to make a difficult choice, and then that's when we can become confronted with the fact that we don't really have the skills or the tools available as human beings to even make a decision that is in any way more meaningful than if you had chosen anything else. And I think that's also why the finale, kind of skipping ahead a little bit maybe, but why the climax of this movie feels so silly, where with Steven,
right, yeah.
He puts his children and his wife blindfolded in the living room in a circle, or in a triangle, I guess. He stands in the middle with a shotgun, blindfolded himself, and he just spins around in the most ridiculous and unproductive way you could go about this. And he misses twice because he's just shooting randomly. He's not even aiming for a person and then going for like a more precise shot. He's just shooting kind of wildly around until eventually hitting the son, Bob.
Yeah, Bob. Yeah.
Poor Bob.
Poor Bob.
Yeah. I guess the other one gets the MP3 player now, but
right, yeah.
But yeah, there was never gonna be a satisfying resolution to that problem, because there isn't one, and I think that's the whole point of it, kind of showing the non-problem that's being presented here, and that's I'm not sure if that relates or if that relates to what you were saying earlier about
I think I think it does, because the horror of those situations in a medical context is like, if somebody is dying inexplicably of a disease and doctors can't do anything about it, and you as a family, if like somebody in your family is dying or whatever it is, and you just have to deal with it, it's like there is no way to make that like feel, you can come to a place of like peace and acceptance about that. As humans, we can like come to a place of peace and acceptance. I think having greater peace and acceptance about death or suffering is possible. So like you can do that, but there's no way you can sort of like undo the kind of tragedy of it. You're just left with that. You're in this like impossible situation. So I think that fits very much with what you're saying, where it's like, there's a sense of a choice here, but it's, if he doesn't shoot them and they all die, that's also tragic. The idea that you can kind of determine which is objectively better morally doesn't actually like it doesn't like help the situation really at all. It's like the people still die tragically. And in some sense, it's like the real problem is in the past, and we can't change that. Like the real problem is the trolley up the tracks, coming down the tracks. It's like the real solution to the trolley problem is stop the trolley. Like don't send it down either thing. But like in the trolley problem, hypothetically, you can't stop the trolley. So you're just left with a tragedy regardless.
Yeah, there's some variations on the trolley problem. I think there's one where instead of you being next to the switch that would divert it from killing one person or to killing 10 people or whatever, there's also one where instead of it's just one track and then you're standing on a bridge on top of it with another person next to you who would be capable of stopping the trolley if that person were to be pushed down by you and onto the tracks, and then preventing the 10, 5, I don't know how many people who are further down the track. So in that example, you have to commit a more active evil instead of just diverting like the switch. But
the real question is like, does taking action to sort of intentionally choose to end someone's life, is that morally wrong, even if you do that in order to like save the lives of more other people due to some event that's been just like set in action is like physics, essentially. Like you have no control over anything. These people are just going to die, a group of some amount of people. And the only way you could conceivably stop that would be by doing something that normally would be like morally reprehensible, like killing somebody. And it's just like, I mean, I guess like ethically there's some sense in which that's like an interesting problem to think about. But I think like you pointed out in the beginning, this is not really a situation that has much practical bearing on our lives. I don't know. Maybe I'm sure ethicists, people who study ethics would say
I think
otherwise.
That's true.
Maybe, but
because I think once you place it into a real life situations, all those characters get like they become, in the case of Stephen, like they become his children or his family, and then immediately this whole value judgment becomes futile almost. And that's kind of, I guess, the point of this whole story. But I do think there's maybe, I don't think this movie is about the trolley problem. I think it just uses it to deconstruct it and then hold up a mirror to like other issues that we face or that limit us as human beings. But I do think for Stephen, there's also the element that he's kind of presented as this somewhat not necessarily irresponsible, maybe more negligent character. It's kind of reading between the lines, but there's this motif where throughout the movie people will comment on his beautiful hands, and I don't remember, I saw this pointed out somewhere. This is not my original thought, but in the opening shot, there's this, the movie opens with this open heart surgery, which is supposedly then the one of Martin's father, where he died on his father died on the operating table. And you see afterwards Stephen having this like bloody gloves from surgery, and he kind of takes them off and throws them away in that way kind of symbolically sort of shedding himself from the blood on his hands. And so kind of him, or at least what's suggested here, I think, is him keeping his hands clean is sort of a character flaw, I guess, where he fails to take responsibility for his actions, and which also might kind of demonstrate itself in the way he presents himself to his children, or the way he acts as a father to his children, which I think there's something that I thought of which might be reaching a little bit too far thematically, but there's this point where once the children realize that one of them might be killed, they start kind of sucking up to Stephen, like, oh, Dad, you wanted me to cut my hair, and I did. Look, I did exactly what you want. Like, please don't kill me. But to me, like, more symbolically, what that made me think of is the whole concept of sort of neglective fathers who then have children who become very conscious of getting their father's approval and feeling that the father's love becomes conditional to certain actions, or I'm not sure if that's necessarily a negligent father, or maybe a father who just is too demanding or too strict, or in some way presents his love as something that's not unconditional in the way that I think a parent's love should be. And so that's when the children kind of symbolically, at least, start feeling like, oh, father is about to take away his love. I have to do something in order to get it back. Again, I'm not sure if this is reaching like too far, but
I don't think, I mean, the thing with this movie is I don't know if there's much that is would be reaching about it, in the sense that I think if you're going to reach with this movie, it's to try too hard to make it all make sense in this like nice, concise little bit. But if you read anything like Yorgos Lanthimos talking about this movie, he doesn't say anything about what it's about, really. He's just like, it's there on the screen for people to interpret however they, see it. And I think a lot of what you're talking about is just kind of, there's a lot of clues there that build this impression of Stephen as just kind of this negligent character to some extent. He's not a great father. One of the other things that we see early on, even in his relationship with Martin, is, he gets Martin this gift, this watch, and he just kind of like, he copies the watch. He just like buys him the exact same watch that his friend, the anesthesiologist, has.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this was the first time I noticed it. But when Martin comes over to the house, for the first time and meets the kids, Bob and Martin are wearing the exact same shoes.
Oh, really?
And I don't know if that's like an insinuation that maybe like he's been buying, Steven has been buying stuff for Martin for a while, and he just keeps getting him like the same stuff that, maybe he bought the same shoes for Bob and for Martin. Or there's also like a lot of weird little details in this movie about the confusion and merging of like identities. So there's this like Steven's kind of becoming Martin's father. Martin's kind of becoming this like child. There's this weird thing where Martin almost feels like he moves into the power of the place of a doctor, and then the family becomes the patients, where Martin's kind of delivering this prognosis of like, well, you're all going to die. Here's how it's going to happen. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm just telling you like the diagnosis, and you just have to deal with it. However, so anyway, I don't know. The little details like the shoes and the watch might be more of a comment on like that side of things.
What did you think of the straps of the watches? That they make a big deal out of getting either the leather one or the metal one, and the metal one is more expensive and preferred by Stephen, but his colleague prefers the cheaper leather one, which he thought looks nicer, and Martin did the same. Not sure if that's anything or just Stephen showing off some kind of status by saying like, oh, the metal one is better because it's more expensive, maybe more durable. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any specific meaning there that I can tease out, but I find that section hilarious for.
Yeah, there's a similar thing with the French fries, where Martin makes a point of eating the French fries last because he likes those the most, and Steven says, oh yeah, I do it too. But then at the very end of the movie, when Bob is dead and they're sitting in the diner again, and Martin comes in and they have this weird, there's no dialogue, they kind of just look at each other. But the daughter, Kim,
yeah.
So Kim, she's now eating French fries, but it looks like she's eating them first. Which I think is more reasonable, because if you save the French fries for last, they turn like lukewarm or even cold, because they cool down really fast, and then they're not tasty anymore. So
my preferred method is I like balance. I like all of the ingredients or all of the different portions of my meal that I'm eating to come to a conclusion simultaneously. So I'm in between the Kim Martin spectrum.
Yeah, but they do make a big deal out of it at the end, or at least the filmmaking does emphasize quite strongly with like close-ups of her pouring like the ketchup on the French fries. There's this big classical piece that's playing in the background, really dramatic, and I'm still not sure what to make of it. But, because that's Martin and Kim, they kind of develop a relationship too. They, which is left ambiguous as to how that relation ends after the movie is over. Yeah. But yeah, they sort of fall in love, I guess, or she becomes infatuated by him. He seems not as into it.
Not that interested in her.
Yeah.
We haven't talked a lot about his character, which is performed by Barry Keoghan, I think is how you say his name. Yeah. Who does, this is my favorite performance from him. I think it's just like really weird and unsettling, which he's good at, but like,
it did remind me a little bit of having seen Banshees of Inisherin now. There's kind of that same twitchy nervousness that's going on.
Yeah.
With it,
this one came first, though.
Yeah. This one is more menacing, whereas the other one is more dim-witted and kind of innocent. But yeah, he definitely knocked it out of the park. I think this was his breakout movie too. Like this, I think this released in the same year as Dunkirk, so which he was also in. It was a very good year for him.
Yeah,
to say the least.
But we don't get a lot of emotion from him or much sense of what's going on with his character. Explicitly in the script, the best idea we get is that he's just after revenge. That's more or less what he says. But
he's kind of this mythical figure, I think, because the title of the movie refers to this old Greek myth which sort of plays out in the same way. I'm not sure if it's worth repeating, but in that comparison, Martin would kind of play out as this more godlike or maybe even demon-like, I guess, character who then curses the mortals with this whole ordeal that sets the whole thing in motion.
One thing I was going to say while I was mentioning sort of identity and the sort of merging of characters or confusion of identity is he has this really weird monologue when Anna goes over to his house. She kind of, once she finds out about the situation and where the curse is coming from, essentially she goes to talk to him, and he gives this little speech about spaghetti and being told that he eats spaghetti in a special way that is just like his father, and then realizing that everybody eats spaghetti the same way, and that this made him really upset, even more upset than when he found out that his father died. And I don't know what to make of this segment. And I don't know how, if at all, that plays into like the broader theme of what's being, explored in the movie there, but it's a great little speech. Yeah. I think it's very creepy.
There's some elements here about the way parents rub off on their children. I think it's also when at the beginning of the movie we see Stephen and his wife being romantic together in their way, which means that they have this weird fetish going on where then Nicole Kidman goes completely limp as if she's under anesthetics, and then Stephen goes and does his thing, and then later when Martin and Kim are together and she feels like, I want to hook up with him, and that's when she also goes to lie on the bed in exactly the same way that her mom did for Stephen, which kind of suggests there that maybe Kim at one point saw them doing whatever they were doing and was thinking, oh, this is how adults have intercourse, but or something like that. Or there's something there about the way when you're young and you see your parents are kind of the primary example of how life is lived and about how adults or people in general interact, and then later you learn, oh, it's maybe something else. I guess that's actually the inverse now that I'm thinking of it, because that's in the case of Kim, that she taking after her mom maybe suggested that she thought that's how people in general do this, whereas Martin thought that because his dad was doing it, that they were the only ones who were doing it. So that's actually more of a contrast, I guess, there than a comparable situation. Yeah, I'm still not sure what to make of this movie. 100%.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, it's a very sort of like the way it's laid out has that kind of, there's so many elements here where it's just kind of a rhyme, a metaphorical rhyme or thematic rhyming where it doesn't necessarily, there's not like a clear puzzle to put together, but it creates this sense of, well, because we talked about like the absurdity of it and how things feel out of control, but also it very much feels like that's balanced against this feeling like there's a world with rules. Like the characters kind of try to avoid the curse for a little while. They go to doctors, they try to find some other solution. For a little while, they sort of like capture and keep Martin prisoner, and they kind of beat him up and try to figure out a way to like lift the curse. But there's ultimately they have to bend to the absurd rules of this world, whatever they are. So there is this sense of like, even in the sort of chaos of it, there's this sense of structure and meaning, and things are happening that have some kind of like order and rule, or like not rules necessarily, but yeah, it's a world with rules and there's order to it, and there's causality. Yeah. It's like you just don't get to understand that, as as one of the people within it. You just kind of have to like play by this set of rules that you don't perfectly understand. So I think, I don't know, there's something weird about that where a lot of these little tiny connections, even if they don't make sense to us outright in a thematic interpretation, they're adding up to create this feeling of like connectedness and sort of order to how things are happening, even if it feels kind of absurd and incomprehensible.
Yeah, I guess in that case, the only order is the one that's presented by Martin, even if that one doesn't necessarily can be elevated to a more general rule. The idea that you take one life, there's a sort of karmic quality to his philosophy of justice, or that old Harambe code, that one of the oldest works on justice, that basically is the whole eye for an eye philosophy, which is in this interpretation, I guess, then sort of elevated into more natural law, even though I'm not sure if that's always the case. So there's a weird, there's kind of a tension there, for me at least, in so far as am I supposed to see the curse as a kind of natural element of fate, in which fate would be or would demand a sort of pound of flesh from Stephen to kind of settle the scales, or is this just another, are they entrapped in a human concept by someone who's just maybe more powerful than them, or more more capable of enforcing his concept onto them, which doesn't say anything about what the natural law or order is supposed to be, but it just says something about how we interact and about how we force our own absurdities onto others, who then become kind of victimized by the absurdity of it. And so there's, for me at least, there's multiple directions to approach this, and I'm not sure which one is the most meaningful or the most enlightening when it comes to saying anything about the way we deal with justice or with each other, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Do you think it's deconstructing the revenge aspect at all, or maybe it's too hard to, because of what you're saying, it's too hard to even tell, because it's like it's presenting it at first like Martin's doing this because he wants some kind of revenge. He wants payback. There's the whole bit where he bites the arms. But to me, you know, I see him biting his own arm, and I'm like, this is giving me no sense of justice. And there's something about the brutality of that moment that I think does almost kind of deconstruct this whole concept as being one that allows for any kind of justice really.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if that's what, you know, is intended with this movie, but I walk away from it going like, you know, especially since we end on kind of this character that seems completely unchanged or unmoved by the outcome at the end. You know, it ends on Martin's face, and there's not even like a hint of like satisfaction or a smile or some kind of relief. You know, once he sees that Bob has died, it's just like has the same deadpan, emotionless, soulless like look that he's had basically entire time. So it very much leaves me with this feeling of like, okay, there's this attempt here to like create this situation that is quote unquote justice for this thing that happened, but really it's not fulfilling that in any kind of way for me as the viewer, or like it seems like for the characters.
Yeah, I guess that comes back to the whole absurdity of the premise to achieve this form of justice, which also, because it's so absurd and so futile almost, and it also automatically means that there's no resolution to it, and that I feel that's nicely reflected in the end. As you said, they're just sitting in the diner. Martin's also there, but he's not with them. He's not closer or further removed from them, it seems. Doesn't seem to have resolved anything for any of them. So yeah, that's I'm not sure, because the thing also is that Martin, it doesn't feel like Martin is really challenged for his perspective, I think, in this movie. Like he presents himself as, you know, he presents his philosophy. You take life of mine, I take a life of yours, or you have to take a life of yours. You have to balance it, but that's never truly engaged with, I think, by the movie itself, which I think is deliberate. It's not a critique, but because I think there's supposed to be some ambiguity there with regards to the way his character functions, as we talked about earlier. Is he supposed to be a force of nature that says something about the way we relate ourselves to some kind of natural law that might be there or not be there, or just the natural absurdity of the universe that has us kind of dancing around as these silly little puppets that cannot conceive of what's happening?
Right.
Or is he a stand-in for another, just a human being or a human concept that's kind of has us going into these absurd motions because of our own doing, and not because of maybe because of the absence of something that's more divine, or like some sort of natural order, and then in the absence of it we have these own little constructs, like we make up our own minds, like, okay, I'm not going to get any divine justice, then I want this, you know, I want eye for an eye, or I want whatever. And so is that just what we end up being trapped in
ourselves? Yeah. I think I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I think it relates to what you're talking about here with his character, where I think to me, it definitely seems like there's some attempt to present kind of how Martin is in power in this situation as being kind of a play on the position a doctor is in sometimes to some degree, or a commentary on that position of power to a patient in this sense, where it's not a critique of doctors, you know, or the position they're in, but if you're someone who is, you know, you don't have a medical education. You have no ability to, heal yourself. You can't do surgery on yourself. You can't prescribe medications. You have to go to this person who has knowledge that you don't have and has a certain amount of like power and ability that you don't have to help deal with this situation. And from the perspective of the patient in those situations, the doctor is kind of simultaneously like somebody who can potentially help you or save you from this problem that you have, but also someone who just kind of sometimes passes down the edicts of like nature in a sense, where it's like it's the doctor's job to be like I think a lot about that scene where Martin is telling Stephen about the curse for the first time, and it really feels like he's almost delivering a diagnosis. He's like, here's how it's going to be, this is going to happen. There's going to be stage 1, they'll be paralyzed. Stage 2, they'll bleed from the eyes, or they won't. Stage 2, they won't be able to eat. Stage 3, they'll bleed from the eyes, then they'll die. And there's a sense in which he's presenting it as just like, this is just what it is. This is that what you're talking about. Like, this is a law of nature. This is just what's going to happen. And it's almost like a doctor saying like, you just have cancer. I'm just telling you the facts. There's nothing like we can, there's nothing really, I don't really have power over this, but they're still like the mouthpiece for this thing. They're the human subjective mouthpiece by which this information about your fate that you as the patient can't really understand without them is being delivered, if that makes sense. I think there's some kind of weird like commentary there about like a reversal of like kind of the horror of that experience as a patient, where I've heard a lot of stories about the conflicting experience where you can be like, I love my doctors and they do these wonderful things. They can help us. They can save us. They can, they have all this knowledge that we don't. But then also there's, at least within the maybe this is a very American thing too, but there can be a lot of like frustration about them not, maybe overlooking things or being overconfident about something, or giving you a diagnosis and then finding out later that like it was wrong for some reason, or even just like
only have enough insurance to save 2 out of 3
right
members.
The 2 out of 3 family members. Yeah, it's not, I can't do anything about it. This is just the facts. This is just the way it is in America. You can only pay to save one of them, so choose. But I mean, even if the doctor, I guess what I'm saying is like, even if the doctor is completely right and they're getting the diagnosis right, there's some kind of weird experience there as the patient where you're like, I have no way of knowing if they're right because they have some kind of knowledge of this situation that I don't have access to. And I think that's kind of how this is presented, where it's like Martin seems to have, it's never explained how this curse is happening or what the mechanics of it are or whether or not he can stop it. It's just like he has access to knowledge about the situation and he knows what's going on, and everybody else who's being affected by it is just like has to kind of take his word for it and see how it plays out in reality and like make their best guess. And so that's where for me this ultimately kind of ends up being like about the horror of that situation of just being like stuck in the unknowingness of like being trapped in like a medical situation in a like dealing with that world and having no power to do anything about it and just having to like ride it out or do the best you can to like deal with a weird situation that you can't fully get a grasp on.
Yeah, I guess like in the sense that they're sort of, the doctors in this case would be the sort of gatekeepers to a world of existential, like bodily terror that can be randomly inflicted on a person, and they can just only, they know more of this world and they can maybe navigate it. And if you enter into it, they can maybe navigate you out, maybe not. But it's kind of more like almost like a, what's the name of that from the Dante's Inferno, the sort of poet that guides the lost souls on the river.
Oh yes, I know what you're talking about. I can't think of his name though.
There was one moment though where the Kim does briefly seems to be relieved from her affliction, where she stands up and she's able to walk to the window before later collapsing again. I'm not sure if that throws a wrench into your or to the extent to which Martin is able to control or stop or not stop what's happening. But
I think that scene is strange because it's not ever clear to me that he necessarily is even like controlling it. Like she goes to the window and then he's not there, or by the time, I don't know, maybe it's just by the time Anna gets there, he's not there anymore. Yeah, I don't know. I think even within that, it's like if you're dealing with a medical situation, there are sometimes these situations where people will briefly get better or something, and then and then go back to normal or something like that. It's
never truly like linear. Whether you're getting better or getting worse.
Right. So I don't know. I might be reading specifically into it in a certain way that wasn't intended, but that was my big takeaway from it watching it the second time. And I still felt that again this time, where I think that to me accounts for some of the themes of like identity merging, where it's like Martin is kind of taking on this. There's a role reversal that happens, and Martin and like Steven goes from the place of the one in power, who can deal out, who kind of is like the arbiter of health and well-being for Martin's family, and then that flips and suddenly like Martin becomes that, and so there's it's just like it's commenting on that dynamic by just like flipping it completely on its head, and then letting it play out from a different kind of perspective, I feel like. But there's also a lot going on here, so who knows? It's a very much open to interpretation.
Yeah, I think that's a fair interpretation, and as I said earlier, for me, it's more I think more about the more general relation that we have to absurdity of existence, the kind of powerlessness, and also the lack of knowledge or lack of understanding that we experience within these forces that can kind of throw us around and cause us into like tragedies that may or not be self or put into motion by ourselves, as it is for Steven. His ordeal is not unprovoked to some extent, but then again, does the punishment fit his shortcomings or his mistakes? There's a lot of these imbalances that we seem to have to deal with, even if we seem to try or seem to want to try to have that balance, as I think Martin also tries to get. I lost my dad, you're gonna lose one of yours, then it's good. But I think that's, for me, is probably maybe the most important question at the end. If we see them all sitting, we see them all staring kind of blankly, and then that's, for me, is I think the final question, like, is it all good now, really, or are we just still being, are we just victimized now by our own absurdity and have essentially resolved nothing?
Yeah. Which I think is definitely, I mean, for me, the answer to that question is no. Like, it's
I'm inclined to agree.
Yeah. Maybe there's some people who watch this and they're like, oh, what a relief for Martin. But yeah, I can't imagine. I don't know. I've never been in a position where I've gotten revenge for something, so I don't know. Maybe it does actually feel good, but
yeah,
it doesn't seem like it. Certainly not when you portray it this way. Thanks so much for listening. Again, if you are interested in hearing next week's episode, you can listen to that right now without any ads by listening on Nebula. You can also listen to our bonus episodes there. We recently talked about the Netflix series Beef. We've talked about movies like 1917, Drive, Babylon. There's a whole set of bonus content that you can get there that isn't available on the public feed. Also, if you're interested in joining our Discord community where we discuss episodes and movies, you can do that by clicking the link in the description below, so check that out. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you next week.